hopefully had a great time last night upon the Intrepid. Just before we get going, this is more of a little bit more of an informal thing in terms of participation. So the commissioners are, well represented here. But any of the proxies that are in the audience or whatever, they want to sit at the table. We'd love to have more input than less. So just feel free to come up and grab an open seat because we're really trying to get a broader sense of perspective on this. So don't be shy. Just a couple of things, just as an introduction. I think we're going to do this a little differently than maybe we've done in the past, and people that have been around for years. The strategic plan, when we started talking about it at the end of last year, was sort of influenced by a couple of things. First off, some of us have done these plans and spent a lot of time on them and made this massive document and then put it on a shelf and never looked at it again. And also the action plan was something that got to be kind of long. So we're really trying to get into something that was more of a working document. It was influenced by me also because we just went through strategic planning in my agency and was very painful. And I have another document on my shelf that I'm probably not going to look at again. So we were trying to get into something more of maybe a more abbreviated strategic planning exercise, a little bit more abbreviated action planning, and use that more as a guiding document. So I won't go more into it because Bob's going to go into a PowerPoint of how we got to where we are today, and we'll hopefully get some good discussion about how we're moving forward for the next 5 years. So at that, I'll give it over to Bob. Oh, before anything, is there any public comment for anybody in the audience? Okay, seeing none, we'll move right into Bob's presentation. Bob.
Great, thank you, Jim. So just a little bit of background on how we got to where we are right now. This is we're currently at the end of our fourth 5-year strategic plan at the Commission. So we've had about 20 years worth of plans. The current one expires at the end of this calendar year. So we need to, as this discussion goes along, the idea is what do you want to do for 2019 and beyond. The 4 versions that we've had, leading up to this, between those 4 versions, there have been relatively small changes. They've been fairly consistent. The direction of the Commission, focusing on fisheries management and science and outreach and other things. We have not completely shifted the direction of the Commission by any means in those 4 iterations of the strategic plan. The current vision is sustainably managing Atlantic coastal fisheries. This group, or all the commissioners, got together earlier this year and talked about potentially changing that. So that's fair game as well if there's any changes that folks want to make to the vision. The working group that I'll talk about in a minute did make a suggestion on that, which I'll get to. The strategic plans, the 4 versions, all included commissioner values, sort of what are the underpinnings of decisions made by the commissioners, and what values should you put on the information that's in front of you, and how do you want to sort of anchor your decisions, and how do you want to sort of guide the decision-making process at the Commission. The plans also include driving forces. So what external forces are out there that are pushing the Commission? And it's climate change and funding and competing ocean uses and other things that are included in all the different versions that we've had. And then the plan goes into fairly detailed goals and strategies. There's the goals are the bigger areas, and under each of those 7 goals, which I'll talk about in a minute, there's between 4 and 6 strategies that detail how those goals should be achieved. So next slide, please. The 7 goals that are in the current plan are fisheries management, which is pretty obvious, developing the FMPs and addenda and everything else that all the management boards do here at the Commission. Obviously, one of the primary reasons the Commission exists. Fisheries science, stock assessment work, as well as other analysis to support management decisions. Law enforcement and compliance, pretty straightforward. We have a section in there that speaks to encouraging folks to comply with the rules that we set up, and it also talks about asking the law enforcement committee to analyze regulations that are being considered prior to implementation to make sure that they're enforceable and the public can understand what they're being asked to do. The habitat program, which is the ASMFC Habitat Committee, as well as the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership, is included under the habitat goal. There's the outreach goal, which is all of our press releases and web pages and fisheries focus and all the other things that we do do to share the decisions of the management boards with the public and make sure the public understands what's going on. It lets them know when public hearings are coming up and other things that, so that they can track the commission and be engaged in our process. The sixth goal is legislative activities. This is the work that Deke and I do, going to Capitol Hill, and a number of the other commissioners here do, going to Capitol Hill and other things, and providing the perspective and providing the priorities and conveying our financial needs to our elected officials in D.C. to hopefully, support the work that we do. This is also the section where if Magnuson-Stevens or the Atlantic Coastal Act or anything else is being considered for reauthorization, we'll engage in that process and provide feedback to the federal elected officials. And then number 7 is the administration of the commission. That's all the financial aspects that Laura handles, keeping all the money going, all the grants, all the travel reimbursements that you guys seem to enjoy, and all the other things that we have to do just to kind of keep the lights on and keep things going at the commission. It's worth noting that ACCSP was put under the umbrella of ASMFC about 2 years ago. There is no goal for ACCSP in the current action plan, the strategic plan. So that was, one of the things we need to add, I think, is a goal for ACCSP that will, probably be a broader data collection goal, but we currently don't have that goal in the strategic plan. The strategic planning process that got us to where we are right now, we had a workshop in February of all the commissioners, and that was just a general discussion about direction of ASMFC and what were some of the important things that the commissioners wanted to tackle. There weren't a whole lot of consensus agreements that came out of that workshop. There were good discussion, but the bottom line was we need to keep talking about this and figure out where we want to go and have a working group get together and provide a little bit of food for thought, and then bring this group back together at the annual meeting. So the executive committee set up a working group at their May meeting. In July, the working group met. I provided a quick overview of what the working group came up with at our August meeting. And based on the outcome of that work group meeting, which I'll talk about in a minute, this group agreed we should have a workshop here at the annual meeting, which is what we're doing today. And then next steps is kind of a question mark. What do you guys want to do after the meeting today? Depends where we end up and how comfortable everyone is with the status of the plan and the recommendations that come out of this discussion today. The work group meeting, this is the cast of characters up on the screen. Safety first, we've all got our PFDs on, and Pat Kelleher took us to the island and brought us back, which is nice, so thanks, Pat, for doing that. So the working group is Jim Gilmore as current chair, Pat Kelleher as the vice chair, Doug Grout, Robert Boyles, and Dave Borden as previous commission chairs, and then I was there as well. And we met for 2 days up on this kind of small, secluded island in Maine and just kind of brainstormed and pulled together a number of recommendations that I'll talk about as we go through the agenda this morning. So it's a great meeting. For the work group meeting, we started with the underlying premise that the states are better off working together than individually. And this wasn't, it wasn't a complete given. The question was, there's a lot of difficult things ahead for ASMFC. Is it, does this model work? Is it the right thing to do? And I think, there's a good discussion, but the group came up with the notion that, yes, we need, the states, the 15 states and the federal partners and PRC and DC all need to come together and work together on these shared management issues, and without, if we try to do this individually, it won't work out. So that was the underlying premise of the conversation up at on Burn Island. And as the discussion went on for those 2 days, the 4 topics that we talked about, and this is how the rest of the agenda for this morning is structured. The 4 topics we talked a lot about were driving forces, priority planning, strategic planning and action planning, and new commissioner orientation. So a lot of the areas that we wanted to make sure we incorporated into a new strategic plan or included in these 4 topics. So those are the highlights, Jim, of where we are and what was included in our conversation. I can answer questions or I can jump into the detailed driving forces if that's what the group would like.
Thanks, Bob. Any questions of Bob so far? Okay, seeing none, why don't you just continue on, Bob?
Thanks, Jim. So the first topic we covered was driving forces. You know, what externally is motivating the commission to move, what's going to have influence on how the commission makes its decisions and influence on the outcomes of some of the projects that we undertake. And there's 4 driving forces that stood out as sort of the primary driving forces, and there's a few others I'll talk about. But the 4 driving forces they're interrelated, and really they sort of cascade, as this slide shows, from one another. And one of the main things that's motivating the commission and is going to influence the commission's process over the next decade or so is changing ocean conditions. It changes distribution of animals, productivity of animals, really everything that we do. It changes the need for the commissions to interact with the councils differently because species are moving, between the council jurisdictions and our jurisdictions, in and out of state waters. So changing ocean conditions is having a significant impact on everything that we do here at the commission. We had a long discussion yesterday about whale interactions and lobster gear, and that some of that appears to have a nexus to changing ocean conditions as well. We don't call it climate change. This is a more politically correct term, changing ocean conditions. So we're gonna go with that. And one of the main things that changing ocean conditions does is, as I mentioned, animals are getting distributed differently than they have in the past. So that motivates a lot of states to come forward with requests for allocation or reallocation of resources. And obviously, that's a tough discussion. It's one of the hardest things the commission has to face. When there's state-by-state shares set up, people get very used to their percentage, and it's inherently a discussion where you end up with winners and losers, and it's a hard conversation. And I think there may be ways to do it where you don't create losers necessarily. We can modify things over time and transition from current allocation to new allocation, and kind of make sure there's not significant pain. But allocation is one of the toughest things that the commission is going to have to deal with over the next 5 years or so. And reallocation obviously needs and is based on state cooperation. Without the states coming together and deciding how they want to cooperate, the reallocation process won't work out and just won't happen, and we'll be stuck where we are. There's some concern based on the working group discussion came up, with some concern that states aren't cooperating as well as they used to. Maybe it's just sort of looking back at better days and everything seems better in the past than it may have really been. Obviously, the states had some tough discussions 10 and 20 years ago, but it seems like there's some renewed need for the states to pull together and work on some of these complicated shared issues. And given a lack of state cooperation, then we end up, unfortunately, with the need for secretarial involvement in the commission process. And we've had one example where the secretarial involvement didn't go as it had in the other 20-some examples. So, and this group obviously has wrestled with the Menhaden issue. What do we want to do with Menhaden compliance? And we've got Jonah crab compliance issues potentially on the horizon and other things. And, the obvious answer is let's try to do everything we can at the state commission level to prevent having to get the secretary involved. But if that doesn't work, what do we do with secretarial involvement? And then, this sort of feedback to the state cooperation. If the states don't have the motivation or the concern or confidence that the secretary will get involved, that may diminish the interest in state cooperation. So the driving factor or the primary motivating factor of the Atlantic Coastal Act is the notion that the secretary may get involved when asked to engage in the commission process and potentially implement a moratorium if the states agree that one of their sister states did not implement the correct regulations and there's a conservation impact. So those are the 4 primary driving forces that the working group came up with. But we also talked about a number of other important but somewhat less significant driving forces. Ocean planning is a big deal. Offshore energy, aquaculture. As everyone knows, there's a lot of wind energy projects up and down the East Coast, primarily in New England, southern New England right now, and those are moving along pretty fast. The commission, most of the activities in federal waters, but they had all those transmission lines and other things have to come back to the states. There's a big state role. There's different governors in different states have different interests in this offshore energy, aquaculture. The current administration is very interested in aquaculture and looks to use aquaculture as an opportunity to balance some of the seafood trade deficit that we have. So, that's obviously, those are important issues. Ecosystem-based management, Atlantic menhaden, ecological reference points, sea herring, obviously, yesterday had a conversation about leaving herring in the ocean as well for some of the ecological services provided by sea herring. Improved coordination with the federal councils. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. With the species moving differently up and down the coast, inshore, offshore, other things like that, we, ASMFC and the 3 councils, I think, need to spend some more time together and figure out who's going to do what. We all don't have enough time to do everything we need to do individually, so we surely don't have enough time to duplicate effort and trip over each other. So how can we coordinate our actions a little bit better with the 3 councils? Stakeholder engagement, things are changing a little bit in how the stakeholders get involved in our process and their willingness to come to meetings and other things. We'll talk about that toward the end of our agenda this morning. And the other question was, how do we handle depleted species? The northern shrimp stock, the southern New England lobster stock, those stocks are in rough shape. The Commission has implemented in northern shrimp, full moratorium for the last 5 years, and stock still isn't rebounding. So what else is there for the Commission to do? So those are the other driving forces that we talked about on Burnt Island. I should have said this earlier. If any of the working group folks want to chime in or add to anything that I say, please feel free to do that. But Jim, that's my quick summary of driving forces.
Thanks, Bob. And you can see we've got quite a lot to chew on right now. And just I'll add one point on the last set of topics. I mean, the first slide that Bob showed you, this one, we're really kind of focusing in on what our immediate needs are. But that next slide with some of the other issues have got a lot of work ahead of us. And in fact, just one point on that ocean planning with the offshore energy is becoming a tax on a lot of the staffing right now. So the same staff that we really need to have working on the Commission now are getting, sucked into looking at offshore energy, and, so that's something else we all need to consider about how we're going to distribute our resources as we move forward. So given that, there's a lot on the screen right now, so let's take some questions, comments, wisdom, whatever people want to offer. Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to thank Pat for entertaining us on Scorched Island in Maine. The highlight of the entire trip was his rendition of scrambled eggs and lobster. He threatened to give us scrambled eggs and clams, but never fulfilled that promise. I'd just like to quickly comment on one aspect, expand on one aspect of what Bob said. And, to me, one of the great strengths of the Commission process is the fact that we collaborate together. And we go in a room, we argue our points, pros and cons, we disagree, but in the end, we try to come together on issues. And, the allocation issues in particular are just an incredibly corrosive, divisive force within the Commission process. And the fact that the environment is changing, we've got this fixed allocation system on a whole bunch of different species. We don't have to go into the specifics of it. But the fact that the ocean conditions are changing, and all you have to do is look at some of the stock status reports, and it pretty much documents that. And we've got this system that is inherently built on state allocations. And somehow we have to address that. Now, the point that I would like to make is that is a really difficult decision for every single entity around the jurisdiction around the table that has state allocation. So we need to allocate and prioritize the resources so that we can do that before it becomes a compliance issue. In other words, if we don't address these types of issues up front and work through the process to do that, accomplish that task, then they become non-compliance findings, and that's just totally chaotic within the current governmental system. It was a little bit more orderly under prior administrations, but under this administration it's a bit chaotic. So I think we need to get on with the issue of prioritizing issues and start to address some of these really problematic stocks in a timely manner. Thank you.
Great points, David. Senator Waters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comments have to do with making sure that we're comprehensive enough on our notion of changing ocean conditions. And I saw the list that was included in the discussion paper, and I think that we really need to look to add, make sure we have enough there that we're really going to make sure that we are covering what are potentially changing ocean conditions, especially out of the known unknowns on this. I'd like to see us add harmful algal blooms. I think we ought to add plastics. 300 million pounds a day going into the oceans, and now the microplastics that are showing up in the flesh of fish, as a report this week has it. And we may face a point in time where it begins to affect the endocrine structure of the fish, fertility issues, but then also it may get to a level that the fish can no longer be edible. So we need to prepare for that. I think that we also ought to make sure that we're looking under changing ocean conditions on sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme precipitation. Certainly this is going to affect the coastal environments, particularly in our estuaries, more fresh water, more acidification. I also think we ought to look at the potential impacts of offshore drilling. As you mentioned, energy, but that's the big one. Senator Kevin Ranker of Washington State has developed state by state, for every coastal state, a constitutional way to prohibit the drilling in federal waters as well as state waters. So if people in the states are interested in looking at that, he will provide that to you. It's Senator Kevin Ranker of Washington. So I see that, particularly this is going to be challenging to add these things to the commission because it's going to require a lot more research, maybe coordination with research. The Ocean Foundation is doing a lot of that, Surfrider doing a lot on the plastics work, and there are some research centers on that. But then I think more particularly, as has been mentioned, this is going to exacerbate some of the structural issues within the councils, among the states, within the commission. And it will also require new cooperation with the councils, the secretary. And on that last point about the issue of the secretary, I think it's going to require much more interaction with the federal delegations by members of the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. That's wow. That was, you did your homework, so that was a good summary. And ironically, HABs you mentioned first. It's odd. We have a thing in New York where we have a HABs group, whatever, and they didn't include marine for some reason. It's only freshwater, and it's kind of mind-boggling. But anyway, you're spot on with that comment, David.
Driving forces. You began with changing ocean conditions, and that's certainly a very important driving force, influencing allocations, state cooperation, and secretarial involvement. I would also suggest that a very important driving force, and this will also have an influence on the executive committee decisions about future funding with that $400,000 that's been made available, is the quality and the quantity of scientific information. We continue to struggle with that. We always have, but I think more so than ever before, questions about the quality and the quantity of the scientific information we use definitely affects allocation decisions, and that then affects the degree to which a state will cooperate, especially if one state feels their information, their analyses that they do with that scientific information they have in hand, if that convinces them that they need to go in direction X, but the Commission says no, it's Y, that leads to conflict. Obviously, it did recently, and then eventually to secretarial involvement. So the quantity and the quality of scientific information is a major driving force, and in light of budget shortfalls, it's bound to become even more significant as things unfold and as we need more information about changing ocean conditions, the degree to which the oceans are becoming acidified. I still wonder about that. It's noted in one of the documents we have for today, a changing ocean condition is acidification. I'm still struggling with that. In the Commonwealth, we just were legislatively given the task of being very involved in a ocean acidification commission. The state of Maine has one. and you did some good work with that commission. But much of the work that I have observed regarding impacts of ocean acidification on marine organisms comes from laboratory experiments where they use very high levels of acidity, so as opposed to minor changes in acidity. So that's important. And I'll just highlight a point that you made regarding offshore energy. Indeed, we have a lot of work to do on habitat. We've done a lot already. It's not going to go away. It's likely going to heighten, that is, our interest in it and addressing habitat change. In my agency, I have a program, a project devoted to habitat protection, evaluation, conservation, and my staff has been drawn away from much of the work that they have to do to deal with offshore energy. Impacts of wind energy facilities on offshore habitat. And that's important, and I'm only willing to do that because I strongly suspect that these offshore wind sites, especially off of southern New England, off of Massachusetts, off of Rhode Island, that those particular sites, once those arrays are in place, they are going to preempt mobile gear fishing. I've become more and more convinced that mobile gear fishermen, dragonmen notably, scallopers perhaps, they won't be able to fish within the arrays for insurance reasons, mobility, weather conditions, radar issues. So that means that, and this may have been mentioned earlier at this meeting, that means that many of our offshore fishermen are going to find themselves displaced. They won't be able to go where they have to go, where they have gone, where catches have been really good. They'll move to other areas, compete with other mobile gear fishermen in those areas that are still open, that have not been preempted. Fixed gear fishermen will likely be able to fish within the arrays, likely, not for sure. So we get into all of these allocation decisions that relate to gear types as a consequence of our being more involved, necessarily so, in habitat issues specific to offshore wind energy. So it's going to become even more notable, even more significant, and even more burdensome for all the states to deal with the impact of all of those offshore sites on our management plans and on the way in which we evolve with again, allocation decisions. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Right whales, certainly we've had a lot of discussion about that. There'll be a lot more discussion about that. That's a driving force, certainly in some areas where the right whales, what eventually will happen regarding the designation. How will that impact the lobster fishery, other fixed gear fisheries? To me, that's a driving force that we obviously have to deal with because it's a very important marine mammal, and there are laws that must be abided by. So somewhere along the line, there needs to be some focus as well on that aspect of a very important driving force that is having a tremendous impact, potentially will have a tremendous impact on the extremely valuable lobster fishery and of course, other fixed gear fisheries.
Thanks, David. And my legislature has blessed me with an ocean acidification task force, which is meeting next week. So my point about more staff doing extra things is becoming a reality for me. Before I go, I had Richie White next, but we were going in alphabetical order, so I've gone through three David. So, Dave Blaze, do you have any comments while we're on the Daves?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other Davids? My last one. So my comments, after listening to some of the other comments here this morning, which I think were all excellent, and I think the work group did a really good job putting this document together. We talk about priority planning, and I think we've heard in the comments so far, the discussion about priorities is paramount. So I think we've got to talk a little bit about how we're going to address those priorities, how we're going to designate those priorities. We face the same thing in Maryland a lot of times about what is our highest priority, and it's great, you designate that highest priority, and then next week the issue du jour comes up, and you've got to go and tackle that. And, just even in our comments here for the last 10 minutes, we're focusing on all those issue du jours that are coming up that we've got to kind of divert as we go through. So, I agree with everything that we've talked about. I think we've got a really good foundation here, the write-up and the work group put together, but it's that priority precedent setting, how are we going to go about doing that as we work forward? So that's my only comment as you finish up the Davids.
Thanks, Dave. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Have been reflecting on the change in the Commission over the last 10, 15 years, and the changes that I've seen have been less compromise. And we always have had contentious issues. We've worked on allocations before, winners and losers. But I find today there's less acceptance of the outcome. And the tendency is to keep going, to take it beyond, as opposed to you lost on this one, you work on the next vote. Now it's, I can't lose, and I'm going to continue to go. I think the out-of-compliance issues, as I remember, were more legislature-driven a long time ago than department or state-driven. And I started to think, well, what has prompted this change? And I don't know that I can say for sure, but one thing I notice is that there's a tremendous amount of change in people sitting around the table. And part of that is retirement and people moving on. But there's also part is proxies being appointed, and then proxies filling the seat with meeting-specific or board-specific proxies. And I think that's led to more drilling down on a certain point of view where that board-specific proxy may come in and be driving an agenda harder than a proxy or a commissioner that's sitting in all the boards, meeting after meeting, might take. So I don't know if there is a fix to that, but I guess would be my suggestion, that we look at the use of the meeting or board-specific proxy and the change in the faces around the table. I think that having more consistency, board after board, I think is very helpful in buying into the commission process and trying to work together and also trying to compromise. And I know Dennis is sitting out in the audience, and I know we've had a number of discussions about this, and if he gets a chance, I'd like to have him chime in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richie. And great points. And we're going to drill down into that, using your term, in item number 9, because I think that's worth a more discussion. Robert Boyles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Richie, great segue. I think you said what I wanted to bring up. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that in addition to being committed to one another around the table as commissioners and as proxies, whether they're meeting-specific or board-specific proxies, we recognize as a driving force that our constituencies sometimes bring a lot of pressure to bear on us to go it alone, or hey, maybe we don't need to cooperate, maybe we can game the system or get a better outcome if we decide to kind of push through and advance our own interests. So not sure how we do this, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's important that as we move forward that we understand and recognize around the table that we remain committed to our resources under which over which we have some authority. I think it's important that we remain committed to one another and our processes that have worked for 77 years. And I think it's important that we remain committed to trying to find the greater good, as Richie White just suggested, that and that we, in addition to exhibiting that around the table, that as we go back home and as we meet with our constituents, that we try to model that, in our actions, in our words, as we talk about trying to deal with these challenges in the next 5 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Well said. I've got Doug Grout and then Tom Foti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been struggling as to where to bring this point up, and that is the Commission's strengths in addressing these issues. To me, I think this is one of the best fisheries management and resource management bodies in the United States because of this very fabric that we're made of and the strengths that we have in addressing these issues. Some of our strengths are the very fact, number one, that we have this 3-commissioner per state setup that was set up back in the 1940s, where there was a administrative commissioner, a legislative commissioner who brought the politics into it and could be our ally at the state legislators, and then the governor's appointee, a very important piece of this. Someone who is knowledgeable about the fisheries. All of us are knowledgeable about it in one way or the other, but the governor's appointees bring that unique perspective. We are an entity that covers the entire Atlantic coast, not just a regional area. We're from Maine to Florida, and we also have our federal partners as a part of our management process here, because as we know, the fish don't just stay in state waters, they move out into federal jurisdictions, and having all those people here at one table making these decisions, I think is a tremendous strength that no other management entity in the United States has. Finally, we currently, under the Atlantic Coastal Act, have the ability to be flexible and nimble in a way that the federal government can't because of NEPA process and the way the Magnuson is written right now. We can move much faster than federal management can, and to address problems. And these are the things that I think we need to try and keep sight of, that we have a tremendous amount of strength that's better than any other management body, again, in my personal opinion. And I think we have to use these tools to help move forward with our strategic planning and how we're going to address all of these driving forces that are behind us right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Tom Foti.
I'm going to talk about 2 issues. I'm talking about the progression of what happened in the last 24 years with the Commission. When I first got involved as a governor's appointee in 1990, the state directors really run the Commission. There was 5-member boards. That's how it was. Governor's appointees or legislative appointees weren't allowed to ask a question if they were sitting in the room. They couldn't ask a question. Only the state directors could basically talk among themselves. We've changed a lot of that over the years. But as we've progressed, we've gotten a little different. When we first started there was 1 governor's appointee and 1 legislative appointee on the board. So that meant if you were dealing with summer flounder, I had to sit with because I was a proxy for a couple of years for Senator Lou Bassano, you had to sit with all the legislators and come for a compromise, because you were voting for all of those legislative appointees, and the same thing with the governor's appointee. So it meant a lot of cross-fertilization between us and try to come up with a compromise. Sometimes you get your worst nightmare. I wanted every governor's appointee and every legislative appointee to have their own vote on a board. As we progressed to there, it wound up we didn't cross-fertilize anymore. We sat with our little delegations, especially for the last 10 years. We go out to dinner with our own delegations. Jack Trevelstead and I were talking about last night. There used to be 30 of us going to dinner together. We throw everything all over the table, and we decide, and we talk about, New Jersey giving 20% of his black sea bass quota up so we can make a compromise on that situation. Of course, Bruce Freeman got killed when he got home, and I think I was the 1 year or 2 years that I wasn't on the commission. I said, I'm going to give you a hard time just to tease him on it, but that's how things happen. Or the time that because I was representing all the legislators on the TOG board, voted New Jersey out of compliance. And some reporters wrote an article about how Fody voted us out of compliance. And I says, that's my job. And there was no problem with that. And I says, if you don't want it, get me off. And it never happened, and everybody realized that's what I was supposed to do. So we lost some of that as we basically got into the little pockets, and we don't do that often enough. We try to do it at the governor's affair. When we have those committee meetings with Dennison, we sit there and talk about what's going on. But it doesn't really sit down. We do it sometimes. So that's part of the thing. We basically have matured over the 20. What I don't want to see is matured like Congress and the Senate has. We need to get back to when we were basically working as a team to try to do what was best. And I think one of the primary examples of that was when we established the Habitat Committee in 93 and 92. It was Al Getz from Maryland coming to me, and he says, Tom, we can do this. You can help us, because we had a great Habitat Committee of the Mid-Atlantic Council. And unlike the Habitat Committee now, it was all of us as commissioners sitting on the Habitat Committee. We started looking at sand mining because we knew that was going to be a problem, which now is a dramatic problem with any state that has beach replenishment. We were looking at offshore drilling. We were looking at acidification of the water because we were talking about that with striped bass. We did all that, and we were sitting around the table discussing it. Unlike nowadays, we get a little report from the Habitat Committee at a policy, and some of us, listen, some of us don't. The second Habitat Committee meeting, we invited the Army Corps of Engineers. We invited the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all the Habitat people to sit there, and we had a 3-hour meeting discussing all the things we were concerned about. That hasn't happened again, I think, in 25 years, because we had driving forces like Bill Goldsboro. I was the chairman for the first 5 years. We have a lot more habitat issues. I think it's more important for the governor's appointees, legislators, and state directors to start taking more of a drive and importance in the Habitat Committee. We need to look at, some of it's climate change, but as a senator from New Hampshire pointed out, what we're looking at is a whole bunch of things. And me, I've been screaming about, Fletcher and me have been screaming about endocrine disruptors and how we've been fixing fish populations. We've done some things right, like weak fish and other species, and they don't come back. And most of those that don't come back are estuarine dependent. And there's other factors. The biggest problem we have here when we sit around this table, when we want to answer those problems, when we want to do to correct those problems, that's not our jobs. I was told that when I first came here. We're not the agency that does that. We're the agency that manages fish, but we don't manage habitat. We try. We make comments. And even National Marine Fisheries Service, when they testify in a permit that they shouldn't be dredging in this area for beach replenishment, it's a fish habitat area, somehow it gets overlooked because or when we go for offshore drill seismic testing, we do things like that, and we ignore the National Marine Fisheries Service, and sometimes we ignore our state when a commissioner, I'll leave it like that, my state would be DEP, has another agenda. He'll take what the agency says and just kind of push it on the table. Joe can't say that, but I can, because I don't care what they do to me anymore. And so that is part of the problem. We need to be honest and look at it, and I think we need to reevaluate. The Habitat Committee does a great job, but we need to look at us involved in habitat, and maybe that needs to be a special committee. How do we deal with offshore? How do we deal with water temperature? And we also shouldn't start blaming, because I've seen this happen also in the last couple of years, where we're looking for solutions to the problems that people got shortchanged because of quotas, because they didn't do things right away, and now all of a sudden saying, well, climate change, the fish are migrating there. Well, sometimes it's not that. And if I look at some of these charts, I've seen that happen. I mean, New Jersey gets put in the region in the south when we should be in the north, because that's exactly where they're migrating to. But because of politics, we get pushed in the south on certain species. So we need to be compromised. And again, the out of compliance things, we need to have a formula for doing it right. It shouldn't just three people to decide whether it's worthwhile or not, because those three people are the ones that voted us out of compliance to begin with. It maybe needs to be an independent group looking at it and say, let's look at the facts. Let's look, it's not going to hurt the resources. Don't put the Secretary of Commerce in that position. Look at it, it's more of a battle between 2 states or 3 states of what they should be doing, and it's not a resource issue. It's how you want to be compromising between one state and another. So I think I've said in my piece here, but it's a body that I love. I wouldn't have put 29 years of my life into it. I figured out one day it's 4.5 years of my life sitting at these meetings, no pay. But it was worthwhile because I think we are the best body. And we can do things that other agencies can do because we have common sense. When we sit around this table, we don't shut fisheries down that we can't resolve a problem for, and we try to do everything else to help the fishermen. And we don't sit here and manage worrying about lawsuits, which other agencies do, and how to avoid them. We're looking at how do we protect the resource, how do we protect the people that survive on them. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tom. Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The thing that's changing, I'm a proxy for the legislature, I'll say that right up front, is we are forced to deal with input from stakeholders, not only from our coastal states, but from Kansas, Mississippi, well, not Mississippi, that's a coastal state. Anyway, you get my point. And, people that are writing hundreds of thousands of letters, and some of them are not even from the United States. And that is something that is changing for us. And it's reasonably uncomfortable to have to make decisions based on tremendous pressure, not only from stakeholders who apply pressure to politicians, and that makes our job pretty uncomfortable at times. At least, that's my view of it. And how do you deal with that? We all have to go home. We all have to face the music, whatever that may be. And of course, if a decision doesn't go the way certain people would like it, now we have the influence of the politicians, as we've seen in a couple of examples. We all know what they are. And that's not going away. It's only going to get worse. And of course, we have some very contentious issues ahead of us. Some of them have been contentious and will be more contentious as we move forward. But it's unfortunate that we have to have that as an underlying reason to make decisions. I mean, it's a reality, but it's something that it fits in every one of those 4 boxes, and it's just unfortunate. But I don't know how we deal with it. Our non-compliance findings have no teeth anymore. They don't seem to me to have any teeth, and that's something that I think we need to get back to our principles of doing the right thing for the resource and trying to filter out noise.
And a good comment you brought up, because we did talk about this at the work group, was the not only do we get all that input, but we're getting so much more of it now in the internet world, where and actually a lot of maybe minor opinions are getting a lot more weight because of just folks that are more technologically savvy. You can suddenly make it look like a very small group is the overwhelming support, and that just really complicates things. So it's a good point, Eric.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's a great point. My little pink phone gets, if it's a contentious issue, I get 500 or 600 texts, and we all know.
Steve.
Yeah, so I'm a new commissioner because it says so on my name tag. And So I certainly respect the amount of expertise and experience that sits around this table. I'm going to use Robert Boyles to quote someone. I have no idea who wrote this, but it says, "Our mistrust of the future makes it hard to give up the past." We live in a different time than we did 20 years ago, and we just have to accept that. The world of social media and immediate information is expected of us. We're polarized as a society, probably more so than we have been in my memory, and a lot of us have to deal with a world of confirmation bias where one group or another simply wants us to push in that direction. I can tell you, coming from a state with a strong commercial and a strong recreational industry, that this body, I think, is one of the most fantastic deliberative bodies I've ever been a part of. And I think it's because of the ability of 40 people to sit around a table and discuss these issues with respect and decorum, and the time that is given to the staff, who are incredible and young and know things that I don't even begin to understand with as far as modeling and stock assessments. That time is vital and it's necessary. And I would say one of your goals should be to try to maintain this window once you enter into a fishery management process, to carve that time out that's needed for those technical committees to come together, for the science to really rule the day, and let the politics bounce off at the administrative level for as long as it can, to allow these guys and the technical folks to come to the table with the best information they can. Because at the end of the day, that's really all we have to go back on. I can defend myself with science, and I can defend it against politics or social media or whatever. But I think this is a terrific organization, and I just, I see a lot of the issues that are contentious with allocation or those types of things, but on a state level, I'll tell you, it's amped up a lot higher than that. So,
thanks, Steve. Lauren?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've defined myself as the environmental educator of this group, and so I will indeed remind us all that Rachel Carson said that every single child on the globe is born with a sense of wonder. But if that sense of wonder is not enhanced and cultured by caring adults, that flame will flicker and then it will die. The reason I'm sitting at this table is because for about 25 years I was taking 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to an island on the Chesapeake Bay, right in the lowest part of the bay, Fox Island. Sunday morning, on a 3-day experience, Sunday morning, I'd get those kids up before daybreak and have them out to greet the sun. And I remember telling those children, you'd better memorize what's happening right out here, because this is as good as the Chesapeake gets. This is it. And I was attempting to help them to develop an accurate baseline for what quality waters, quality environments can produce. In 30 years, none of us will be around this table. In 30 years, every one of those children is going to be voting. And I hope our commission will never lose sight of the importance of, in some way, touching that sense of wonder for those children, so that there will be a continuation of conservation that's based on on a really strong foundation block of understanding. So I offer that to you for your consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. My grandmother lived to 97, so I may still be around here in 30 years, but that's it. John Clark.
Thanks, Jim. I don't mean to be the cynic, but I think one of the things that's happened with cooperation goes back to allocation, and I think, and the changing ocean conditions, is allocations become more blatantly a zero-sum game, and we're looking at diminishing allocations in a lot of cases where a state can say, well, I can give up a little here because I'm going to get something over here. Instead, when everything is bad news, it makes it harder to cooperate. I mean, you put a bunch of rodents, rats in a box with plenty of resources, they cooperate fine. The resources go down, they tear each other apart. I'm not accusing our states of being rodent-like, but I'm just saying that it's easier to cooperate when things are going well than it is when things are not going well. And, you know, Roy can attest, and Craig, that we hear about Delaware Bay, everything being bad at the same time, right? I mean, there's less of this, less of that. And as I said, it just makes it a little more difficult. I don't think anybody comes here to not be cooperative, but when you say, well, you're going to have to take a cut on this and a cut on that, it does make it tough.
Yeah, good points, John. I mean, and not, you know, it emphasizes this is not an easy job we all have, so good, well said. Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll offer, I've been listening to the discussion, and it's really informative, and I agree with, everything that I heard. I'll add on to what Commissioner Clark just said and offer that I agree when things are limited, we definitely struggle. I think we struggle also when things are really good as well. So we struggle with success as well. But the point I wanted to make was more in line with Commissioner Murphy. I think he sort of hit some of the keys and the tools that I think, going all the way back to what Commissioner White said in the beginning, we've got this struggle, and a lot of folks said gamesmanship and all of these things that are going on. It seems to be getting worse from my limited time, and I think one of the problems is we've backed away from integrating science. We use it, we talk about it a lot. It comes to the table, but then there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's our problem. In dealing with that uncertainty, we have too much flexibility, and so it's a strength of the Commission, but I think right now we're struggling with how to manage that flexibility, but also I think we need to box ourselves in a little bit as well. And so finding that balance, I'm not, although I jokingly might offer we should automate the whole thing and just use hit buttons on our computers, and that is a joke. I don't actually mean that. But we could hit buttons once in a while and have some bounds on what we're doing. And I think it does, I think the really important word that Commissioner Murphy used was it makes things defensible. It might be unpopular, but if you can go back and say, hey, look, we had a policy of how we were dealing with uncertainty that we made outside of striped bass or menhaden or whatever species. This is how we as a commission want to deal with uncertainty. We have a policy on that, and then we operationalize that, and that's what we did, and it's unpopular with our folks, but we have a way to defend ourselves that is logical and thought out ahead of time. And so being able to integrate into our systems the science, I think, is a step that we're missing, but we're working on. And so I see that for myself as a relatively new commissioner, as I have some optimism, because I think we're going to succeed and we're going to be able to use these tools to better collaborate, because we're going to be able to better defend ourselves when the decisions are unpopular.
Good points, Jay. Okay, I think we've had some great discussion on this, and I think we're going to move on to the next topic, which is priority planning, and Bob's going to give us a little background on that. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple people hit on this notion of selecting priorities. I think David Blazer, David 4.0, or whatever we're calling him here, hit on that in his comments. But a couple of the things that came out of the Burnt Island discussion, there's competing demands and limited resources. We don't have enough resources to do everything that that the 45 folks around the table would want to do. And the limited resources are really three dimensions. One is money, obviously. The other is staff time. And the one that's not talked about a lot that came up at our discussions in Maine was commissioner time. You guys have jobs and other things you have to do when you go home, and there's only so many things, so many big decisions you can focus on in one meeting week. And how do we as staff support that, and how do you folks prioritize your time to focus on the biggest issues that are in front of you? So, focusing on the high priority issues is one of the things that the working group suggests the commission put more time into selecting, what are the big ticket items you really want to tackle, and some of the smaller ones may have to wait for a little while. They may be delayed, and they may have to sort of be put on the back burner. But sometimes when when we kind of put Band-Aids on some of these big issues, we just have to go back and revisit it a year later, and we never really dispose of some of the big issues. So, the working group's suggesting, a lot more focus on priorities, and when we get into action planning at the business session after this meeting, we'll talk a lot about that, and we've reconfigured the action planning document to reflect that. One of the other things that was talked about was a threshold to reduce minor changes. In other words, the commission may want to consider setting some minimum level of change that's needed to justify the initiation of an addendum or an amendment. So, if it's only it's a minor tweak of the system, and there's only a couple percentage point changes for one state, maybe the commission pushes that off and says, I know that's really important to a few constituents in your state, but it's really not going to make a significant difference up and down the coast. So we're going to postpone that action for a little bit and focus on something that'll affect multiple states or have a bigger impact on the resources. That's a tough thing to do, but that's what the working group thinks and it makes sense that some of the small sort of boutique changes that are suggested sometimes take up a lot of bandwidth at the staff and commissioner level, and maybe put those on the back burner. As I mentioned earlier, priority planning needs to involve the councils, the 3 regional councils. As everyone knows, one of the good examples is cobia. The South Atlantic Council managed cobia, but the fish and the harvest were moving inshore and up the beach. So we interacted with the South Atlantic Council and decided the commission would assume the management role for cobia, and the South Atlantic Council would get out of the cobia business. And we're finalizing that transition now, and that was that worked pretty well, and it made a lot of sense. And we didn't end up in a situation where both bodies are trying to manage cobia simultaneously. So those sorts of decisions make sense. And so, there was, the South Atlantic Council had scheduled a meeting of the 3 councils to start talking about how they're going to deal with species crossing the lines at the council level. And I think we need to, continue that process and engage in that process with the 3 councils and talk about, how we allocate the work that we have to do. And the final bullet there, short-term focus, sometimes creates long-term issues. And it's kind of what I talked about earlier. If we're really just focusing on the short term and putting Band-Aids on big problems, we're really not solving these long-term big issues that the commission has. So sometimes it's hard to do when you've got constituents and other folks pressuring us to make changes. But it's if you can step back a little bit, let's solve this problem sort of holistically. We may not have to deal with it in 1 or 2 years down the road. So those are the issues that came up regarding priority planning. But the focus really is let's select the big ticket items we want to tackle and let some of the other ones rest for a little bit.
Comments on this? David Pierce.
I'm looking at the document that was prepared by staff summarizing the following actions offered up by the working group. And And obviously it's important to focus on high priority items. Sometimes it's hard to identify those. For example, one state may have as a high priority lobster, Massachusetts, Maine, not so much farther to the south where lobsters have gone the way of the dodo bird due to environmental reasons. But I look at the list, and I just wanted to comment on the last one in the list, which to me is quite important because it was identified by the working group as what could be our fate without improved state cooperation. And obviously, that's what we're focused on, state cooperation, the greater good. But this particular reference is alarming because, frankly, if, as described here by the working group, if it happens, then we can take a fork, stick it in us because we're cooked. We'll be burned, okay, charred. And that is, if we don't, as it says, if we focus only on short-term gains, we will create long-term problems, and then without that state cooperation, there's a potential for Magnuson national standards to be applied to the Atlantic Coastal Act. Wow. The potential, we need to avoid that at all costs, because if we ever get to that particular point, it'll be a clear indication that we as states have failed to cooperate, that we have done ourselves in. Once we have Magnuson national standards applied to the Atlantic Coastal Act, well, let's see, how is that going to work out? It means ASMFC will be subjected to all sorts of lawsuits. It means that the Secretary of Commerce will have control, basically, over the final word because the national standards apply to the Act. And we all know what the Act means. The Secretary of Commerce steps in if there's, if non-compliance findings. So, to me, that is the sword that hangs over all of us, and nothing else would propel me to be cooperative and collaborative than to do whatever is necessary to avoid that. Because, as we know, members of the councils, New England, Mid-Atlantic, South Atlantic, it's a tough chore to be a council member and to then have to work with all of the requirements, which slows down the system dramatically, and frankly, nothing will kill our ASMFC staff, kill their motivation, kill their enthusiasm for this process, than having to suddenly transition and to act as a staff of a council, where the staff is inundated with detail and redundancy and defense. It's a mess. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm willing to continue to cooperate.
Good point, David. Thanks. Other comments? Okay. Go ahead, Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I should have brought it up in the previous presentation, but under priority planning, all of our fishery governance bodies, we know how to ratchet down on a specific species, both to commercial and recreational fishermen, when the species is in trouble. But as we see, not only at the Commission, but on a federal level, I'll give bluefin tuna as an example, management has not responded to how do you treat a recovered species that's bountiful, plentiful, satisfying both recreational and commercial fishermen in the management plan, and bringing it back home to this commission that I feel very comfortable in. I think the process works a lot better than on the federal level because we do have 15 states, the entire East Coast. I don't think we pay enough attention to recovered species. Right now there's a menhaden issue. Well, I hear about climate change. They're finally swimming their historical path. They go to the state of Maine. And yet, we we keep hearing about non-compliance as opposed to coming to this table and saying, hey, you know, we have a lack of herring now, and we're trying to rebuild herring, keystone forage species in the Northwest Atlantic. So for now, the bait industry might need a higher percentage of menhaden. So we as a body should be able to mitigate. And I'm not saying long-term for the next 100 years, but immediately we have an abundance of menhaden, so why not give a little more up to the bait industry? Black sea bass, very contentious, and then people start talking about, well, there's winners and there's losers. But the reality is there has been a shift in black sea bass, and I think it's the job, and Bob Boyles is here. He likes to make Wikipedia comments. You know, I'm going to say it, and you're probably going to dislike me, but Bill Belichick's saying is do your job. And that's the purpose of this commission. So we talk about climate change. We talk about everything that's going on, but there's no resolution. And I think one of the priority in priority planning, we have to learn how to manage recovered species that are very abundant, so both recreational and commercial fishermen have more access to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Other comments? Tom Foti.
I find that the most difficult time we have managing species at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, whether it's red snapper, summer flounders, when we have joint management plans. We are not allowed to do what we think is right. We are forced to do what the other agency thinks is right, and it causes all kinds of problems. It also, as Ray pointed out, we have species like black sea bass, summer flounder, and scub that we could be fishing on quotas that are a lot different. If the commission was running it, we would be fishing on quotas that are a lot different. Same thing with red snapper in the south. And what we basically look at is that we have lost the trust, and part of that hostility that we get out there is from what we get beat up at home, is because they see the fish out there, they see that we're managing species like on summer flounder where we have to throw 30, and I experienced it this year on a boat. We had 40 summer flounder and we kept one, so we killed 4 fish by hook and release mortality according to 10%, and they were all 18, 17 and a half to 18 and a half when we fished on the New York side. So all firm fish. When you start doing that to public day after day, they lose all trust in the system. So it makes it harder for us to do our job and harder to gain the respect of the public. And again, my fear is that if you don't trust the laws, like you don't trust the speed limit on the Garden State Park, where you start basically doing it. And we didn't have that 15 or 20 years ago. When we started rebuilding these stocks and people started seeing, they started recovering, that they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, we got to the light, and then we put the blinds down. And that's one of the biggest problems we have dealing with the public right now.
Thanks, Tom. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, everyone, for your great comments and suggestions this morning thus far. Just kind of continue on the vein that Tom Foti started on. I think when we're considering priority planning, the reality is we should have a plan when our management breaks down. Specifically, the types of things I'm thinking of is when our decision-making gets bumped up to the federal level, and then the result is not what this deliberative body originally intended. We should be prepared for this. I think it's something that's going to be more prevalent in the future. We've seen one recent example and a threat of another one over our heads, specifically referring to summer flounder and then to menhaden. So I think we're going to see more of that, and we should have a plan of how do we react. Do we form a subcommittee? Do we issue a findings paper? What do we do? And I'd rather be proactive in that regard rather than reactive. Thank you.
Great point, Roy. I think that's, and yeah, it's not going away soon, and we really need to start figuring out how we're going to deal with it. So, any other comments? Well, this has been helpful. I think, this is one of the tricky ones, is like, as priority planning is always such an interesting thing to do. You come up with what you think you're going to prioritize, and then 3 weeks later it all changes. But I think this has been at least helpful for us to move forward. So if there's no more comments on that, I think we're going to get to strategic planning and the action planning. So, Bob?
Great, thanks, Jim. So, there's been obviously a lot of great discussion this morning, and now the sort of question is, how do you guys want to memorialize that discussion? And what do you want the strategic plan to look like, and what do you want the action plan to look like to capture some of the ideas that came out this morning and, will come out through the rest of this meeting? The working group in Maine talked a lot about the value of the current documents, and by the documents, I mean the 5-year strategic plan and the annual action plan that we put together that details all the activities that the Commission will engage in for each calendar year, sort of implementation plan for the strategic plan. So what are those valuable documents to the Commissioners? The 5-year strategic plan, we felt that it contains a lot of good information, a lot of important things are detailed in there, but we didn't think that Commissioners, took that off the shelf, read it more than, once after it was actually implemented, waited 5 years, and then we'd dig it back out and see what needed to be updated. So, what can we do to make more of a guiding document and a strategic document that helps Commissioners and provides some direction to the Commission is one of the questions we were asking. And the other part of that is the annual action plan contains a lot of detail. The current year's 2018 action plan is 36 pages long. It's got tons of details. A lot of the tasks that are in there are things that were ongoing activities that we do year after year, we're obligated to do. So, one of the things that we focused on there was let's pare down that annual action plan and just, hit the highlights and minimize the sort of repetitive wording in there of tasks that have to happen year after year. And so we have done that. The action plan that we'll talk about during the business session later this morning, it's only 18 pages long. We've cut it in half basically from what last year's action plan or this year's action plan looks like. So, we have modified the documents a little bit, but the question still for the group is what do you guys want to do with this notion of a strategic plan? This will be our 5th one. If we do another 5-year plan, which seems to be the direction, is to be 2019 to 2023. It seems that paring that document down as well and making it a more efficient document, hitting the highlights of really the priorities and the strategic direction that the Commissioners want to go in seemed to make sense to the working group. And one of the things that came out of our discussions of the working group was the potential for a new vision. As a lot of the conversation went around this morning, cooperation, collaboration seemed to be one of the key things that folks want to focus on. Make sure the states continue to work together, the Commission continues to work together, and sort of the fabric that makes the Commission is state cooperation. So the working group suggested maybe we should change the vision to cooperatively managing Atlantic coastal fisheries. Focus on cooperation in the vision of the Commission. So you'd be replacing the word sustainable or sustainably with cooperatively. And some of the conversations went that, managing equals sustainability. You're not managing in an unsustainable way. So, the focusing on cooperation in the Commission's vision was another thing that came about. So for this section, I guess the question posed to this group is, what sort of documents do you want to memorialize and provide direction and guidance to the Commission over the next few years?
Thanks, Bob. And I'll start off just by, I think the underlying theme is we want them, to be shorter, but shorter so that they're working documents, so that they don't get put away. What I've been doing in my shop back in New York is that we've done a thing called a priority action plan. So suddenly when, things are shifting around, the famous expression, what's going to come off the plate or what's going to move around? And if you've got this massive document, it's very difficult to even get into that. So a shorter version of that, you can figure that out as if a new priority comes up, how you can adjust the other things, and how that's going to affect the strategic plan. So that, again, I think is a thing we need to push on. So now the floor is open for comments, opinions, or this. Okay, let's go with Senator Langley first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I would suggest or recommend that the strategic plan become part of each of these meetings. Sit right on your desk when we come together and meet. Talk about the benchmarks that have been met, where we are in the progress of meeting those. Celebrate those that have been met. But if it's not measured, it'll never get done. So I just think it just becomes integrated. Quickly recap. Here's where we are. Put it up on the board. Here's our strategic plan. Here's where we are today. Here's where we hope to be at the end of this week or going forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just on the new vision, I'd hate to lose the word sustainable, and let me say why. We can cooperatively manage the fisheries until they don't exist anymore. Lots of cooperation, catch all the fish, and we're done, right? And also, I understand from what we've heard that the cooperation is coming to the foreground, and that's good. I do think, though, that if we're going to get that cooperation, it means we have to have a shared vision of sustainability. And, of course, sustainability includes acknowledgement of economic factors and so on. So something like cooperative management to sustain Atlantic coastal fisheries. Also, without that word sustaining in there, we are not acknowledging that our core basis is in science and what defines that sustainability. And so, to me, that's always been the high ground of our vision, that if we're going to get the states to cooperate with each other, it's because, you might win some, you lose some, but you at least can share a vision of sustainability as it is defined by the science. Now, we'll wrangle about that, what it means for the biomass and so on and so forth, but I would hope that we come in here with the notion of sustainability as that which will finally suppress the state interests and the interest groups enough to let us be cooperative.
So somehow put sustainability back in as one of the words in there, and I guess well, you're a legislator. You can wordsmith this and come up with a solution.
I did, and you can do what you want, but I said cooperative management to sustain Atlantic coastal fisheries, but do with it what you want. We're not going to wordsmith.
Thanks, Dave. Chris Patsavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of how to prioritize what we do during the course of the year, kind of goes back to what we discussed earlier, and then putting it together in a strategic plan. I've been thinking about that a lot, and heard a lot of comments about obviously not everything can get done at the same time, and we need to determine if something else comes up, what are we going to give up? And one thing the Mid-Atlantic Council does out of their strategic plan is put together deliverables for all the species they manage, and it includes the stuff that we have to do every year. But I think what that does is gives us a full picture of what's possible during the course of the year, versus what isn't. And just speaking for myself, at ASMFC meetings, we get into a board meeting and we'll kind of dig into a certain issue, and I'll find myself kind of looking at that in isolation, forgetting briefly that this is just one of many management boards and one of many managed species that we manage. So I like the approach of just making sure that we don't overextend ourselves, and just looking through the action plan. It's in the briefing materials how it breaks things into high priority versus medium to low priority is a good step, just to make sure that we just don't max ourselves out on things that could possibly be picked up a year or two down the road, as opposed to things that need our immediate action, but we just don't have the time because we're dealing with other things. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Andy Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I cannot echo strongly enough Senator Waters' comments. I wish I had gone before he did, because he said almost exactly what I was going to say. Having been with an agency for over 30 years, I've been through 5 strategic planning efforts, and the one issue that ties everybody up in knots for a large percentage of the discussion is the vision statement. People fight over it, they can't get past it, and only when they get past that do they feel like they they can work on the other parts of the plan. A vision statement, in my understanding and my vision of it has always been, it's something to reach for. It's not your mission statement, it's your vision. It's something beyond where you are today. And as soon as I saw that come up on the screen, that sustainability was removed from that, that gave me great concern as well. So I think we need to come up with some combination of terms that remembers that sustainability is what we're about, but all the concerns that went around the table today that have been brewing for a couple of years about a lack of perceived or real cooperation somehow has to be figured into that, but I think you cannot divorce the two terms. So somehow we wordsmith that, we come up with a result maybe by the end of today, maybe somebody makes a motion if it calls for that, but I agree that both parts need to be in there and that a vision is something that we reach for, because as Senator Waters said, we can cooperatively take this right down the drain, and according to some accounts, that's what we're doing. So I think we can do a lot better with our vision, and then that'll guide the rest of the process. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. And I would bet that Senator Waters would take a collaborating amendment to the mission statement as a positive step forward. So hopefully we'll get to that. Other comments? Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for the record, the clams were not for the scrambled eggs. They were to put in pancakes with... So I don't want anybody to be confused. So we do not eat clams and scrambled eggs. The strategic action plan, the way this slide lists out is really key. It really captures the conversation. And I probably started it off, says, does anybody ever read the strategic plan? I mean, it's a big document. It was very comprehensive. And it did get us into this longer conversation about a shorter, more focused priority setting exercise. But I want to reiterate something that Senator Langley said as far as sort of a feedback loop. We don't have that now. And I'm not sure I would go as far as the senator from a meeting-to-meeting feedback, but we ought to have some sort of a feedback to see if we're going to have a shorter document, just making sure we're staying on task with our priorities and revisiting the priorities if we need to do that. The council priority setting is, I mean, the priorities are so damn long we can't get to all the priorities. So having something a little bit more focused, something a little bit more nimble, something without buttons. Sorry, Jay. I think would be a worthwhile addition to this document.
Yeah, good idea. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to echo that because, and I think it might fall to staff to some extent, but the last couple items that we've been talking about are being focused, and then you get to that bullet on your last slide where if you're too focused and you're paying attention to the short term, you're causing long-term issues. And I absolutely don't contest that we have to prioritize and deal with the issues at hand, but to have someone reminding us more or less, maybe not at every meeting, but at the appropriate times, of those other issues that are boiling up, right behind that. I think that that's something that it's the only way forward if we're going to prioritize, is to keep that other stuff that's in the background on our plate.
Thanks, Joe. Dr. Pierce.
Well, with regard to the vision and maybe a revised version, I do agree that sustainability should be maintained and cooperatively managed should be included. But there's one thing that really needs to be part of the focus, part of the vision, and that's habitat protection. We spend a lot of time on that, and frankly, It's been given short shrift for a long time. We have policies regarding habitat protection. They're tough to adhere to because often we can't do anything about habitat protection. That falls outside of our realm. So the environmental agencies within our states, but nevertheless, we are supposed to work with those agencies to help them understand what we need and to give them some good advice as to how habitat needs to be protected. So something along the lines of, and this is a little bit repetitive, but anyways, sustainable Atlantic, the vision would be sustainable Atlantic coastal fisheries managed cooperatively with habitat protection necessary for that sustainability. Something along that line, somehow working the habitat in there so we can send the message to, again, sister, brother agencies involved in habitat protection that, we're concerned about that and we're involved in it, and we will be providing advice, and our advice should be sought out.
Let me add a comment to that, because, and maybe I'm unique, or New York's unique New York. In my state and in my division, I have, the Bureau of Habitat under me. So when I say, managing fisheries sustainably, it's implied in my head that that includes habitat. And I ran the habitat program many years ago, and actually what was one of the shocking things when I came to ASMFC was that habitat was like kind of a separate issue. So in my mind, when I say managing, habitat is implied in that. And I'll go to North Carolina and Steve in a second, but I mean, and you guys used to have this great bumper sticker. It said, "No wetlands, no seafood," and it was the most elegant bumper sticker I ever seen, and I still think I have it on an old car or whatever. So my opinion is, and so we don't go down the rabbit hole of where I don't want to go, is to get this, mission vision statement, and suddenly it's 3 pages long, because we get right back to there's so many words in it, it waters it down. So maybe not as simple as what Robert Boyles has suggested, no fish, no, whatever. It was like 4 words. I think I want to try to keep it a little tighter, but I'll see what other people think. So, Steve?
Yeah, and I have to say that's the bumper sticker of the North Carolina Coastal Federation, a nonprofit that we do a lot of cooperative work with. But it really does speak to the elephant in the room in a lot of fishery conversations, is the capacity of the habitat itself. So I wanted to remind people on priority that at least in my experience, if you've ever looked at the Eisenhower decision matrix, or that Stephen Covey hacked, we tend to spend a lot of our time in the urgent and important box, and really we want to be in the important and not urgent. And it goes back to what I said earlier, in that the strategic plan needs to be long enough to provide the time to do what needs to be done. And we don't need to be urgent in our decision making. We need to be deliberative and take that time, as controversial as that sometimes is. So I just, when we're looking at priority issues, let's make sure that they are provided with enough time to actually accomplish those.
Good point, Steve. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thinking about some of the comments, having the vision statement more visual to us so that we're thinking about it more. So when we have motions up on an amendment or an addendum towards the end, maybe big bold type up above it, have the mission statement. And then maybe on the document, on our documents for addendum and amendment stuff, have it on the bottom, but not a little tiny type. Have it something that stands out, so it's we're aware of it and thinking about it more.
Good idea. Lauren.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sitting next to a gentleman who can speak eloquently about vision, and I am reminded of the recuperative powers, really amazing recuperative powers of nature, that allows animals to recover if we give them even just a little bit of help. I would strongly prefer, instead of sustainability, what we used to say, I guess I'm an old-timer, but we used to say that we wanted species that were fully recovered, which is at a higher level than sustainability in my mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I don't know, it wasn't that long ago, we were having this conversation about being cooperative with each other. And 15 minutes later, you can forget about it. It didn't happen. And so, I mean, to me, you know, we can talk about it, we can pat each other on the back and all this other crap. It never happens because we have our constituents to deal with, as I said earlier. So you might as well put sustainably managing Atlantic coast fisheries and leave cooperative right out of it.
Okay, well, there's a dissenting opinion. I will tell you, when I showed up at a hotel in Portland, Maine, and Eric saw me, he said, "What the hell are you doing here?" So anyway, just okay, other comments. Let me get some people I haven't talked yet. Tom, I'll come back to you. Doug Rapp.
So I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. If all of us can't recite the vision statement off the top of our heads, then it's way too long. In fact, I think it's sort of like a violation of the Pierce rule. So keep it however we come up with. You know, I'm still a cooperative person, Commissioner Reed, and I agree with the sustainability comment, but let's keep it short so that we can all recite it and know where we're going, what our vision are. Hopefully we'll have a collaborative and cooperative vision.
Thanks, Doug. Tom Foti.
When Sandy hit New Jersey in October of 2012, I looked at what would be the long-term effects of a hurricane on the bays and estuaries of New Jersey. So I called my good friends from Florida, my good friends from North Carolina, because they were dealing with a lot more hurricanes over the years, and says, what studies did you do after the hurricane to find out the impact on the stocks and the habitat afterwards? And they all just answered the same way. We didn't have the money to do that. So there has been. Now look at this year. We've had the one in North Carolina and South Carolina. We've had the one in Florida, Panhandle. We'll have all kinds of FEMA money and everything put in there. But to see how it's affecting the fish or how it's changed the fishery studies, there's going to be no follow-up to that. I am now in the process in New Jersey of sitting with BOEM, the Army Corps of Engineers, to figure out how because 1998 we started looking at how we were going to stop the water coming in from the ocean over the Barrier Islands. So now it took 20 years, but now we implemented those things we put in 2003 after the hurricane was starting to do that. Now they're looking at how do we protect the bays. So of course they're looking at floodgates that cost billions of dollars like they do in Amsterdam and things like that, and saying, are they feasible for New Jersey? But nobody is looking at the impacts of what will happen on the bays and estuaries with those kinds of projects. I bring it up, and they says, well, we'll do that. But over the years, I've learned that when the Army Corps or any other agency says, we'll follow up to see what the consequences of putting windmills in, how do they affect fish, or seismic testing, or when we basically eliminate the lumps but for beach replenishment, the follow-up studies are never done. And I think we have to be, one of the vision is we're going to look at these storms occurring more often. We're going to look at the effects. We're going to look at a lot of more attacks on the ocean, whether it's windmills and things like that. And we're not going to know the effects unless we really push to look at the fisheries impacts of those. And that should be part of our vision, because, it's not going to, as somebody was saying the other day, saying before, 30 years from now, most of us are not going to be sitting. I'll be 101, so I know I won't be sitting here. But, one of the things I've always looked around this table is I'm not doing this for myself. if I'm doing it for the next generation. As Lauren and everybody, we all sit there. I think all of us look at that because we're not going to see, like, I'm not going to see sturgeon rebuilt. By the time it's rebuilt, we actually have a fishery. I'll be in the ground somewhere, or no, actually in a bottle of ashes. But anyway, we should need to look at it, what's going on, and we're doing it for the right reason. We're looking for the next generation, and we really got, that's one of the things we got to do.
Thanks, Tom. All right, Robert, you're going to get the last word on this one. How fitting.
Fish for today, fish for tomorrow, fish for you, fish for me.
Amen. Can you put that to a musical jingle so we could really get it?
If you give me a bass, I will, yes.
Let me try to do this. I actually like Senator Waters' suggestion to have a little tweak to this to keep it, I think, inclusive and simple. So let me just throw this out there. I think if I correct me if I'm wrong, but cooperatively manage to sustain Atlantic coast fisheries. Is that was pretty much your suggestion, Dave?
Really, last ways I said cooperative management to sustain Atlantic coast fisheries, but really, it's not the words that counts. It's just that sustain is in there somewhere. Yeah.
Well, let's use that as a model. Is that a tweak we could do to do it? Go ahead, Craig.
If I might suggest putting the word sustainable between managing and Atlantic.
All right, let's get a couple of more comments on that. We'll see. Doug.
I was trying to be quiet, but I would leave it just like it is and add for a sustainable future at the end and call it good. Cooperatively manage Atlantic coastal fisheries for a sustainable future.
Okay, do we have other variations? Andy Shields.
Thank you. So I typed this out so I could be cogent. Sustainable and cooperative management of Atlantic coastal fisheries and their habitats. Based on what I heard around the table, I felt like that brought other comments into it.
I'll tell you what, I think, so we don't go down the rabbit hole, we've got a bunch of different suggestions on this, and I think everybody wants to include sustainable. I think we'll figure out how to do that. Remember, we have to put this in a document and come back and really get on the plan. So why don't we'll work and come up with some ideas on that, and then we'll try to include those concepts and see where it goes when we get to the final document. Is that agreeable to everybody? Okay. Seeing no objections, I think we'll proceed with that. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, Commissioner orientation.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a bit of a sort of motherhood and apple pie. Who can't agree that it's important to orient the new commissioners? But I think Richie White may have hit on this earlier about the amount of turnover that we've had recently in the commissioner ranks, and to the working group, it was pretty obvious that spending time with the new commissioners, helping them get up to speed, is really important and really valuable to keep the momentum of the commission. The idea is orientation to foster relationships as well as the continued collaboration. It's easy to sit across from the table from somebody you don't know and don't have a relationship with and kind of vote against them and not want to cooperate with them. But if you develop a relationship and understanding of where they're coming from and what's going on, I think that commission's a lot better for it. So it's sort of finding ways to integrate the new folks into the commission fold quicker and better is an important thing to do. And it's sort of a two-pronged approach is what we are coming up with. It's leadership meeting with new folks, going out to dinner, just getting to know them a little bit better, allowing them some time to ask questions of commission leadership is really important. And then staff meeting with the new commissioners to make sure the new commissioners know, which staff person handles which department and what they, if you have a question, here's who you go to for these sorts of things. And just, it's kind of, we talked about two different parts of orientation. One is logistics. How do you fill out your travel forms? and who do you go to if you've got a question about fishery science or whatever it is. And then the other is the cultural information. How do you sort of indoctrinate the new folks into the culture of ASMFC and have them get up to speed on how the conversations happen and how things occur at the board meeting and how things occur outside the board meetings and, between meetings, phone conversations, email conversations. So, again, this is, it's on the surface, it's pretty obvious that the more we do, more time and effort we put into new commissioner orientation, the better we're going to be. But we thought it was, definitely something that needed to be, stated directly in a strategic plan that, we need to focus time and energy on orienting new commissioners given the high rate of turnover and, some other folks around the table may be contemplating retirement from what I've heard. So, we'll have to backfill their spots, when they do retire or move on. So that's, again, pretty straightforward, but just something that's really important and worth highlighting from the working group.
Questions on this? Tom Fody and Richie White.
I guess it's 25 years ago, I walked into the Barnegat Bay Estuary Program and found out about a different process, because the estuary programs, they don't vote on things, they try to come to consensus on how they do the plans. And after 18 years on the policy committee and 7 years on the advisory committee, I'm still at the table. And I know we can't do consensus here, but we did a lot of workshops in the beginning. How do you come to consensus? And I'm thinking that might be helpful for us. I know we're not going to all, do kumbaya around the table, but when we're dealing with an estuary program, we're dealing with builders, we're dealing with competing uses, and it basically taught us how to work together, to come with a plan together if we can do that. And maybe we should think about somehow to workshop on that, and how do we come to consensus instead of fighting all the time.
Thanks, Tom. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe Dennis and Roy have brought up the idea of having the LGA luncheons twice a year and kind of keep that up with the turnover of commissioners and the new commissioners coming in to that will help orient and get the relationships between commissioners increase that. I don't know if Roy wants to comment on that.
Good, Roy.
Just very briefly, I think it is a good idea. If it accomplishes nothing other than serving as a meet and greet, I think it's beneficial, because becoming a new commissioner is a bit of a heavy lift for someone who has another job, legislative priorities to address back home, those kinds of things. And so anything we can do to ease that transition would be helpful.
Couldn't agree more. Other comments? Justin.
Thank you. I'd just like to say I appreciate the focus on this as a relatively new commissioner around the table. I think the staff does an excellent job of the sort of logistics end of it, of getting new commissioners up to speed on, how do you do a travel, reimbursement, how do you handle going to the meetings and all that. So I just wanted to make sure I said that I think the staff does a really good job of that. I'm a firm believer that the best way to learn is by doing. So in terms of getting new commissioners integrated in sort of the culture of the commission and learning how the process works, I think trying to get them involved in working groups or working with people on putting together management actions. I've been participating on the Black Sea Bass Working Group that's been working on the addendum over the last year, and that's been really great for me in terms of getting up to speed on the issues and learning the FMP and really learning some of the history behind the management. I think that's one of the real challenges if you're new to this table, is to grasp and understand the last couple of decades and how it got to where it is now. I was reading the lobster FMP review on the train on the way here the other day, and it's just, looking at the list of all the management actions, it just, sounds like a Greek odyssey, like how, we got from there to here. So understanding that stuff, though, is really important to understand how we got to where we're at now and where we're going. So I think just trying to really quickly get new commissioners actively engaged in working on something would be really helpful.
Yeah, it's a good point, and and just, when I started, which is 11 years ago almost now, back before we had a lot of electronic stuff, I literally got promoted into the job I'm in now 2 weeks before the annual meeting. And the former regional executive director called me up and sent me 2 documents, the commissioner manual and the briefing book, because nothing was even on CD at the time. So I had it stacked this high and said, just read it. And Vince had called me and said, just read this. Got any questions, give me a call. And the daunting part of that, and it was kind of like, it was on-the-job training back then. So I think the importance of, really getting an understanding of how this thing works and then drilling down into it, I think is important. Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was a new commissioner, I was very fortunate to have Mark Gibson and Dave Borden, and well, all right, whatever, David. I had Mark Gibson. I didn't have Dave Borden. Let's leave. But it's pretty daunting to come into this room. It's a big group, I mean, I made a lot of new friends until 15 minutes ago when I pissed everybody off, but that's fine. I didn't mean we don't cooperate. Sometimes we can't. That's what I really meant. But I'm not afraid to go out and meet new people. But I think it's also the onus is somewhat on the existing commissioners to reach out to the new members. It's kind of tough to walk up to somebody you don't know and try to convince them or to see it your way or understand what they're doing. Certainly having some training for new commissioners is awesome because it's a pretty daunting group. I just want to make sure my opinion is that the existing commissioners within the state and outside of the states should also reach out to the new people as well and say, hey, how's it going or whatever. And that makes things a lot easier in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, great point, Eric. I think that's all our jobs is that we, essentially do that. And in a neutral way, too, because I remember my first meeting, somebody came up to me, let me talk to you about striped bass. So it was a little bit of maybe not totally gracious. So any other comments on this? Okay, I think, we're going to work on this, and I think this is pretty important, and I think, the more people come into the table understanding that big picture of what we're doing here. I mean, we all come with our state perspectives or whatever, but it's really that bigger picture that we have to really try to focus in on. So we'll get some, meat on that, and we'll talk about it when we come to the next meeting, I think. All right, the next one is a discussion on the use of proxies. Bob?
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we talked about earlier, there's a lot of turnover and a lot of different approaches that states are using. Increasing number of proxies, meeting-specific proxies, board-specific proxies are being used. If you look at the overall roster for just this meeting, excluding the federal partners, there's 68 individuals that can sit at the table and vote during different times of this week. If you look at our overall roster of standing proxies and commissioners, there's 86 people that can come to the table and vote at different times with different, mixing and matching of attendance and those sorts of things. So, when you have that many people, there's a lot of different opinions, a lot of different folks, a lot of different faces around the table. Some states are having multiple administrative commissioners come to the table for different species, and some have, some of the LGA folks have different proxies for different things as well. So you end up with a pretty long list of people around the table that can vote at different times. And this is just the state level as well as PRSC and DC, not the federal agency. So, there's the question is, obviously that the more people that come to our meetings, the more it costs. So that's just math. That one we can figure out. The next item there, the second bullet down, is inconsistency between boards. That one's a little bit more nebulous, but if you've got different people sitting in on different boards and you're swapping out commissioners quite a bit, is there a sort of a dilution of consistency between boards and understanding, if you've got one person that sat in on the striped bass board, striped bass board struck a compromise of some sort, but now you've got a new commissioner for that state that's sitting in on the summer flounder board, and again, they're working on something that, they may not understand earlier compromises or how states are working together, and then you've got, next is the lobster board with yet a new person. So, is that a concern? That was raised as a bit of a concern in the working group, all the turnover, all the different faces around the table. You can't really, there's less ability for commissioners to know each other and understand some of the interactions between commissioners if you've got a new face sitting for each of the states over and over again. So, the point here is, the long-winded point is there's a lot of different people that can sit at the table, almost twice as many. We've got 45 commissioners. Technically, if you've got 15 states and 3 commissioners, you've got 45 folks. But if you look at our roster, we've almost got double that of people that can come to our meetings and vote. So it's a lot of different people that have the ability to come here and vote. So that's the issue. Not sure how folks want to tackle it or which parts of this you want to dig into more. But there's a fiscal and a policy question associated with the number of folks.
Thanks, Bob. Before I take questions, let me just give in my perspective on this, because this one kind of came up as a surprise. Actually came up from the staff, too, some of the people that have been around for a long time. When I took this job, and, again, a decade ago, my understanding, after reading that huge manual and everything else, was that, my job was to, sit at every one of these board meetings and represent, be an administrative commissioner, and that was my job, to be at every meeting. And it was just kind of very simple. And then I think a couple of years later, I got some comments about, why are you sitting at every meeting? And I said, well, I thought that was my job. And the understanding I had with a proxy was that if things came up, whatever, which they do for all of us, is that you had the opportunity to have somebody fill in for you in those, those occasions, but, more of a rare thing. And back then, in 10 years ago, I think that was the general sense around the table. Most of the people that I remember, every meeting you saw the same faces. It was the same group, and you'd go from striped bass to, for lobster to whatever that topic was, and you just would see the same people. But more recently, that really has evolved into a lot more people at the table, and it's not only more people, but I think sometimes it's it's maybe the focus of it, because I think as a commissioner, you really need to look at that big picture, the science, the socioeconomics, the political issues, and that's what gets integrated in a commissioner, and some folks tend to be more technical maybe or whatever, and they just take one aspect of it. So again, my perspective was very simply that was my job, and I really need to put all my energy at sitting at the table. And if I wasn't going to do that, then I needed to get maybe somebody, if there was a proxy, a full-time replacement of me. But again, that's my perception, so I'll open the floor up to some discussion about maybe is that what other people thought, or is it completely different, or they have different ideas. Steve Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. I think my perception, as I've been around here about 20 years, give or take, was that the proxy issue never really came up as far as a problem was concerned. And what we've done in Virginia is utilize proxies based on their specific field of expertise. It never came up. And we've got board-specific proxies, I think, for 3 or 4. So we're, as far as if you want to consider an offender or part of this, we're right there with them. But I guess that was the perception that I have had as I've gone through the years. And I, as I've always said, I'm not a fishery scientist, but at the same time, from a management perspective, the guys that came in here that were proxies for board-specific based on their expertise, they didn't vote any, their vote was my vote. I basically made the decision from a policy perspective as to how the vote was concerned. Yes, there were different faces, but there were different faces to provide the best information and the best interaction possible. So that's why we have done what we've done. Conversely, I can certainly see the issues that are being raised now. Number one, expense. I'm very, very keen as far as that's concerned. And if a decision's made otherwise, then we'll work with it. But I just want to get on the record that that's why Virginia has had a number of different proxies coming up here, and never once, and it's not an indictment to anyone management-wise, but never once has it ever been said to me that you need to whittle them down or whatever, or things like that. So now it's on the table and fully understood. So I just want to get that on the record. Thank you, Jim.
And Steve, thanks. And there's, it's not an offender. I mean, this is not, this is very simple. Right. Again, I think it's worked for different states depending upon their situation, but the one thing I looked at was 10 years ago when I started, we actually had no board-specific proxies back then. There was, they were all ongoing, and Robert Boyles was the one permanent proxy at the time, so, different thing at that time, whatever. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, this is complicated and a difficult issue. I clearly understand the states having proxies for the administrative commissioner, and that because that person leans more towards being an expert in a particular species. The governor's appointee is not in that position. The governor's appointee brings the perspective from the state, from the governor, from the constituents in the state. So the problem I see is a governor's appointee that then appoints a proxy, and then that proxy appoints a board-specific proxy. And that's starting to get beyond, I think, the scope of what this is all about. Legislative commissioner, obviously they, almost all of them, have to have proxies because the legislature's in session on a lot of our meetings. So that's a natural and necessary. Again, then that person sitting in that proxy sitting in the audience and having a board-specific proxy at the table, that's an issue, for me. I mean, that if the person is in the audience, he can be sitting at the table. That would be my sense.
Thanks, Richie. Doug Graham.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I was on the same vein as you, and I had been involved with the commission going back to the late 80s, early 90s at the technical level. It was my job to be here at the board, but I also saw value after a couple of years of being at a management level here as the administrative commission, of having someone who was could be my proxy as a backup on certain cases where I might be sick, or there was one time where one of my parents passed away and I could not be here, and I didn't want to just throw someone into the fire. So I think there's a value from the administrative commissioner's standpoint of having someone that can is trained enough and knowledgeable enough of not just certain species, but all the species boards and the policy board, and so that in those cases they can fill in. Same thing at the council. That's why you're allowed to, the administrative counselors are allowed one proxy. So I see that value, but I also agree with Richie's perspectives as far as the governor's appointees and the legislative commissioners.
Thanks, Doug. Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I align my comments with both Doug and Richie's comments, but actually take a slightly different slant. I see nothing wrong with having proxies. I think the fiscal impacts have to be evaluated fairly carefully. I mean, we have limits on the amount of money that we can spend. The other point I would make is that there are times where there are synergies between each of us sitting around this table listening to a discussion that doesn't necessarily involve our own expertise. For instance, if last meeting I went in and listened to the herring section before we disbanded it, and that actually was a really useful discussion for me. So if you have a high rotation of proxies, I think you lose something because they're not being exposed to all of that other discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Robert Boyles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a symptom. I don't know that this is a problem. I agree with the director. The fiscal impacts associated with the commission supporting travel are something that we need to pay close attention to. As you know, we've had a lot of conversations over the years with respect to trying to level the playing field with respect to public influence, with respect to people's positions as proxies, as meeting-specific or board-specific proxies. But I think at the end of the day, I look at this and I believe that if our culture, our organizational culture and our values are strong, and I appreciate the discussion we've had about the vision, I think if our culture is strong, and I think we can have this expectation among people who come to the table that, look, we are going to work towards sustainably managing fish, cooperatively. And I think if we reinforce that, I think this is actually a good problem to have. I don't see an issue with a bigger tent of folks around the table. I've heard a lot of positive remarks from our colleagues about the strength of the commission and the value and the deliberative nature and the cooperative nature of this group. So again, I think fiscal impacts certainly something to be managed and we need to pay attention to, but I'm all for a bigger tent with respect to inculcating the values that we hold dear around this table and growing our constituency that way.
Thanks, Robert. Tom Foti.
As I've been sitting around this table for years, I've seen 6, 8 state directors maybe in some states have changed hands over the year. It's the only training ground for these people to basically learn the staff of the agencies. Basically times have changed. When I first got here, state directors were staying on for 30-something years. Bruce Freeman, when I walked in here, and Jack Travelstead were basically permanent proxies for both of them because, that's the way it was done back then. Sometimes the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service was responsible for both fresh water, hunting, and everything else, so they didn't come. The governor's appointee is another situation. When I go for a proxy for me, I basically go to the agency. I says, here's the name I'm putting forward, and then I go to the governor's office and say, this is the name I'm putting. Is there any objection to that name? I wish I had a proxy that would show up, except that when I can't make a meeting, because unlike the state or like most of you, New Jersey's on every board. We sit here all day long. I have to sit here, and I look at people rotating in and out with their proxies, but that comes part of the job. Russ Allen is my proxy right now. Now, I didn't pick a person that agrees with me all the time, but I picked a person that basically understands the issues, all the issues, and can do a competent job. And I think as long as we basically do that, it's a great asset. Besides, in case something happens where I can't be here, or one of the other governor's appointees or legislative appointees can.
Thanks, Tom. I'm just struggling right now what to do with this. I think right now, the discussion's been very good, and I think, and maybe there's different, ideas on this, and I think it's good at this point that we've identified this, that's something we probably need to pay a little more attention to. I think I'll probably sit with Bob and we'll maybe discuss a little bit more, maybe in terms of what we have in terms of the rules on proxies and stuff. Maybe we'll discuss, maybe to educate a little bit more what the proxies are really for, and we'll go from there, because I think we could probably talk about this for a long time, and I'm not sure we'll never reach consensus on anything, but we'll have informed consent, which is you'll agree with the decision. So if that's agreeable to everybody, I think we'll continue this discussion at some point, but at least I think it's out on the table now. Think about the proxies you're putting on and make sure it makes sense in terms of, the overall operation of the commission. Okay, next we have discussion on public to commission decisions. Bob?
Okay, thank you. Don't have a slide on this one, but this is one I'm sure the group could talk about for hours, so we don't want to get into that level of detail today. But the public's engaging with ASMFC differently than they used to in the past. Tony did some analysis on the public hearings that we have over the last few years. We've done 136 public hearings. 15 of those hearings, no one showed up. 63 of those hearings, 5 or fewer folks showed up, and 83 of those hearings, we had 10 or fewer folks show up. So we're just, the bottom line is getting a lot less folks coming to public hearings. Is this a symptom of fatigue and folks are just burnt out on going to meetings? There's probably partially that. Are they looking for different ways to engage in the commission process? Possibly. Are they disenfranchised by fisheries management? Possibly. There's probably also symptoms of that we talked about earlier. Some stakeholders don't want to engage in this process because they want to go right around us and go to the highest level elected official they can find and engage at that level. So that there's a lot of different things and a lot of different reasons why people aren't engaging with us as much as they used to, or are engaging in different ways. But I think it's worth exploring how to better get feedback from public. If we start a Menhaden action, obviously we got 180,000 public comment letters, form letters. A lot of them are form letters, but different topics, lobster and summer flounder and some others, always bring out a lot of public comment. But there are the remainder of the species. We don't striped bass is big, but the remainder, a lot of times we have hearings where no one shows up, or someone travels, hops on a plane, travels somewhere, and they only talk to 1 or 2 individuals, which is fine, but it may not be, may not be the bang for the buck that we all had hoped for. So I don't know, Jim, if we want to try to solve this. This really isn't necessarily part of the strategic plan, but it is a strategic question on how do the commissioners want to engage with the public, and is there a better way to do it? We live in it's 2018. Is there a better way to do Survey Monkey surveys online or something like that to get feedback, or what is it? But I think there's a lot of room for improvement on how we interact with the public and how the public feels they are being heard and getting their information into the ASMFC process. So that's the background, Jim, and again, probably a big issue.
Yeah, let's take a couple of comments on it, and we'll see. Joe Cimino.
Thank you. And I don't have any creative solutions on new ways to engage the public, but I think one of the challenges that I've seen is when that public information document hits, and we deal with some complex issues. We can spend hours trying to figure out what should be taken out to the public, and there's times where there's sub options. And I look at these documents. Kirby came for eel and did a fantastic job trying to help people understand this, but there was no way eyes weren't going to glaze over. So I think, with what we have right now, without violating any sunshine laws, I would kind of hope that there are times where, as plan development teams realize the challenges and the questions that they have from that one meeting where they heard what has to be in this document, that there could be some feedback, back and forth by email exchange on cleaning up that first document that hits the public. Because I've seen folks come to these meetings so upset that there was no chance for the public to have input, really missing that first level of public hearings that come around, because it's so far removed before decisions finally happen. I saw that in Virginia with folks sitting at the annual meeting saying they didn't have a chance to have input on cobia, and I think it's a long process. We have kind of 2 shots at that document because we do everything at the meetings, but I kind of hope that there would be some way, as that document develops, to kind of have some tweaking.
Thanks, Joe. Pat Keller.
So we're running into this similar situation just within our own rulemaking within the state of Maine. We have times where we'll hold, we've obviously got a very long coast, so we're not holding one single public hearing. We'll hold one in southern Maine, one mid-coast, and one in eastern Maine. And the level of opinions as you go down the coast are very different. And so we run into situations where somebody we just did some rulemaking recently where Nobody came to 2 of the 3 meetings. In the 3rd meeting, we had all kinds of people from the Mid-Coast go to Eastern Maine because of the interaction of the issue and how people were looking to access different areas for scallops. So my staff came to me and said, we're getting frustrated that nobody's coming. I won't tell you what my initial reaction was to that, but it boiled down to a much more polite way of saying it doesn't matter if they don't come. You have to hold a public hearing to give people the opportunity to speak. And that direct interaction with the public outside of one of these damn things, one of these computers, is so much more valuable. Eric brought it up earlier, this whole idea of people sending letters that aren't even from this country, these form letter things. I get no value from those. I get much more value from recreational and commercial fishermen face-to-face, whether there's 2 of them in the room or whether there's 200 of them in the room. And I just think we can't lose sight of that face-to-face interaction. From a financial standpoint, I think the states can do more to run these commission public hearings without having staff to travel to them. You know, if we're holding 3, we'll have staff come to 1. You know, and that's a way to help alleviate travel. But maybe we need to consider doing more of it without worrying about staff traveling. Although I think there's benefit for staff to travel to these too, to hear these comments and concerns directly. So, thank you.
Great points, Pat. I've got John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot of times I think most states find themselves in that position where there are plans that your state may not be a big player in, but you feel like if every other state is having a hearing, you have to have a hearing. And I know we've tried to coordinate with Maryland on species that aren't that big in Delaware, and we've had joint hearings that way. But I know recently was it ASMFC or the council had a webinar option for a hearing, and I just don't know if that's something you can consider more in the future. I think there are some species where we feel kind of like we have to have the hearing just because we do have a fishery, even if it's a very small one. But if this option was there, we put out press releases about the webinar to make sure the public knew what was going on and allowed people to comment that way. So I know there is value in face-to-face, but if you're not talking to anybody, there's not any value. So I think at least you're giving your angling public the chance to, or your fishing public the chance to comment that way.
Yeah, good comment, John. Just as a counter to that, we're trying to use more modern technology to do this stuff. Unfortunately, we have a culture of some of our fishermen that want postcards and meetings all the time, and they don't want to go, and they don't have iPhones or pads, and they don't want to do that. So just an interesting counter to that. So, Rusty's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what happens, I've represented commercial fishermen, or as we say on the bay, watermen all my life. And we have so many state meetings and that Dave and other people have to go to it must be every night of the week that we got meetings. The rockfish meeting or striped bass, the oyster meeting, the clam meetings, you just go to crab commission meeting, and it goes on and on and on. And every one of these commissions are filled with people that are interested in whatever commission they're on. So my perception is that the watermen say, once we attend all these meetings, the state knows what we want, so we depend on the state to go to the Atlantic states and present our position. So therefore, when we hold a meeting with the Atlantic states and Maryland, and there's not much attendance, it's because all these committees have been meeting and meeting and meeting, and they depend on the state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Russ. Okay, we're running up a little bit against time, so I'll take 3 more. I got Doug, I got Chris Savage, and then Eric, and I think we'll wrap this one up. So, Doug?
I think one of the issues behind having low turnout is this has to deal with something we brought up under priority planning, and let's focus on the big management actions, because a lot of the things where we don't get a lot of people there are because we're micromanaging the fishery, and people are kind of burnt out by the number of meetings. So if you had a few significant actions coming up, you'd probably have good turnout. And, anytime I get over 10, I know it's a real important issue out there. I think there's also, but at the same time, I think one of the great strengths of the Commission is that in their framework act or addendums, which is sort of the equivalent to frameworks, is we do have hearings in every state, and the Council does not have that. You got to come to the Council for specifications and frameworks. And I do see great benefit in having a staff to come up as frequently as possible to give these presentations, because I think it provides a consistency in what's put out there. As much as I try to be unbiased as a commissioner, if I'm giving the presentation, I can see my opportunity to put my own little slant in, and as long as having the staff come up and do that avoids that whole thing about maybe having an inconsistent presentation of the actual problem and the issues.
Good point, Doug. We actually tried an omnibus multi-species hearing once. That was a nightmare, so don't even go there. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Notice over the last several years in North Carolina, the stakeholders are very focused on our state-managed fisheries and that process. Pretty good turnout for our Marine Fisheries Commission meetings, and if we have any public hearings, we get written comments on a regular basis. And then it's the exact opposite for ASMFC and council-managed species, and I think staff could probably look and just, if they track turnout over time, now in North Carolina, not many people show up to our public hearings for ASMFC hearings compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago, and not really sure why. And we'll reach out to interested stakeholders, let them know about these hearings, and probably should do more. What is puzzling to me, though, it's not so much just the hearings and whether they're convenient or not, is they don't provide written comments either. So they're just really not involved at all. One comment, and I'll end here quickly. One comment I did hear from one of our most recent public hearings is we only had 2 people show up, but just through social media and networking with folks in the fishery, they were representing a lot of people, dozens, maybe more than that, people who don't really have time to follow this process, understand the true workings of it, but they trust these 2 guys to speak for them. And I don't know if other states are seeing that or not, but that's probably something that's maybe going to happen more, just with with just people's lack of time and just availability of information through social media and other sources. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, Eric, you get the last word.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Mr. Kelleher that a face-to-face is invaluable. And Mr. Bat-Savage just hit on a point. Okay, if you have nobody show up, that's obviously something. But if you have 5 people show up and they represent an organization of 30 people or 500 people or 100,000 people from Kansas, that means something. As far as the economics of running a meeting where there's 4 or 5 people there, well, you know what? We're talking about topic-specific proxies from a lot of states. I mean, there's the person that should run your meeting for you. I can help you out. That gives them something to do, and it also saves you a little bit of dough. But I just, discounting a meeting that only has 5 people doesn't necessarily mean there were only 5 people. And that's important, but that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. All right, there's been great comments about this, and I think we're going to just kick this around a little bit more just to make this, some of the meetings more efficient and explore different ways of doing this that isn't going to bankrupt the commission and keeps us on track. So that being said, we're going to move to the last topic, which is what we're going to do with all of this, and Bob's got some suggestions.
Well, I think, obviously great conversation this morning. Appreciate everybody's input. I think the best way to move forward would be for staff to draft a new 5-year strategic plan that's pared down a little bit, from the versions that we currently have. I'll use the work group as a sounding board to bounce drafts off of and ideas off of. We'll bring that document back for the February meeting, have the full commission review that and consider approval of that document in February. It seems to be the best approach to go forward. And then the meeting immediately following this is the business session where we're going to review the new version of the action plan, annual action plan. And so if folks are comfortable with that approach, then we can adopt that as a new template for our annual action plans. And then we'll, I think we still need to work on this sort of the idea of a living document that is updated as priorities change and those sorts of things. And I think the action plan is probably the place to do that. So, even if there's an annual action plan approved by the business session in an hour, I think that document still needs to be a living, open document that we can modify as priorities change throughout the course of the year and, provide that update to the commissioners as time goes along. So if everybody's comfortable with that timeline, we'll draft something for February.
Everybody okay with that? Any different ideas? Okay, seeing everybody nodding, I think we'll just proceed with that approach and move on. We're at the point where we're going to take a recess. Is there any other things that people want to bring up before we actually are not going to adjourn? You have to stay in your seats for a second because it is that annual time to have our picture taken, and Laura and Tina they have like heavy equipment over there to beat us into a pulp if we disappear. So we have to stay in the room, and I'll let them come up with the plan as how we're going to actually do this. So don't leave yet. We'll take a little break before we start the business session, but we got to get our picture taken first.